Don't you love a good story? We use stories. And a good story not only recounts something that may or may not have happened, but it answers important questions, teaches important lessons. For example, maybe someday my granddaughter, Gemma Lee, will ask, Grandpa, is God real? And I might reply some way like this. Well, Gemma, your mom and dad, your grandma, Dean, and I have walked with God and sought God and lived for God and with God for a long time. But Gemma, let me tell you a story about something that happened long ago. Many years ago, Grandma Ian and I were driving home on the interstate, and it had just rained after a long dry spell. And so the rainwater mixed with the oil and detritus on the road and turned the road into a slick sheet of ice. So Grandma Ian was driving very carefully, way below the speed limit, which is unusual for her. But as we crested a hill, lo and behold, down at the bottom of the hill on the other side, there was a jackknife tractor trailer stretched all across the 4 lanes of interstate traffic road. And Gemma, you know what happened next? Well, Grandma Ian touched the brakes. She didn't want to hit them hard because she knew the road was slick. But the brakes locked up tight as a drum even then, and we began to slide like a bobsled down a snowy slope. And she turned to me and she said, Ray, we're not going to stop. Gemma, you know what happened then? You know what it's like when the roller coaster comes off that last hill and comes into the station and just stops. That's what it felt like. Even though our tires were sliding like they were on a frozen lake, something or someone grabbed that car and stopped it. We believe it was God's angel. So yes, Gemma, God is real. We use stories to answer important questions. One of my favorite comedians once posed a question to his audience that he had heard in a philosophy class in college. The professor asked, so class, why is there air? We take it for granted, but really, it's a fair question. Why is there air? And the comedian replied, simple, to blow up basketballs. For thousands of years, people have used stories to answer questions like, why is there air? Why are there stars in the sky? Why are there days and weeks and seasons? How did the world come to be, and what is our place in it? Open your copy of God's Word to Genesis chapter 1, first chapter in the first book of your Bibles. A place where we will find answers to those very important questions. 4,000 years ago, a man we know as Abraham, who at that time was called Abram, lived in the city of Ur in a place known as the land of the Chaldees. It eventually became known as Babylon. Now, Abraham had gone to a temple. At the temple, or around a campfire, or perhaps around the dinner table, maybe even at bedtime, Abraham would have heard the very famous story of how the world came to be. That story is known as the Enuma Elish. And it goes something like this. In the beginning, there was just the waters of chaos. Apsu, the god with wings like eagles, ruled over the fresh water, and Tiamat, the dragon, ruled over the salt waters. And when their waters mingled one day, that was how the younger gods were born. Now, these younger gods, being young, were disrespectful of their elders. Consequently, their parties went long and were loud. So long and so loud, in fact, that Apsu and Tiamat could not rest, could not sleep. They desperately needed their rest. And so one day Apsu decided to solve the problem by murdering his children. Haven't we all been there? Well, word leaked out to the younger gods of what their dad was about to do. So one of them slipped into his bedchamber one night and slew Apsu. But when Tiamat found out that her consort had been murdered by one of her children, she declared war upon her children. Well, the younger gods were trying to decide what to do when one of them, a god named Marduk, stepped forward and said, "I will fight Tiamat." And the other gods agreed that if he prevailed, then he would be king of the gods, which is important if you're a Babylonian because Marduk was your patron god, okay? Well, sure enough, Marduk rose up and fought with Tiamat in a great battle and slew the great dragon. And then, standing over her corpse, he drew his sword and he split the corpse in half. And he took half of the corpse and made the heavens. And the other half of the corpse made the land, the earth. And Tiamat's tears became the two most important rivers in the world at that time, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Well, the war was over, but Marduk soon realized that he and his fellow gods still needed to rest, they still needed to relax, and they could do neither because they had to do everything themselves. So Marduk rose up and slew one of his brother gods. And he took the blood from that god, and he created men and women to be the slaves of the gods. So to the Babylonians, the world was born out of battle and bloodshed, so war is good. And people were nothing but slaves. And because the world was born out of the body of an evil God, the world is evil. Now, because you know the story of Abraham, you know that one day, the God of the Hebrews, whose name is not Marduk, but Yahweh Elohim. Sometimes just Yahweh, sometimes Elohim. When you're reading your Old Testament, if you see Lord in capital letters, that's Yahweh. And if you see the word God, 99% of the time, that's either El or Elohim. You'll see Lord God, that's Yahweh Elohim. One day, Elohim called Abram to leave his familiar surroundings, Ur of the Chaldees, and go to a strange land. Well, since you know the story, have you ever wondered why Abram would do such a thing? The Bible doesn't tell us. But I suspect it is because, as a descendant of Seth, the son of Adam, and a descendant of Noah, builder of the ark, Abraham had heard different stories of how the world came to be. We'll call it the story of beginning. And in Genesis 1, and by the way, a nifty bit of trivia, the title of this book in the Hebrew Bible is not Genesis. It is Beginning, or In Beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. In beginning, Elohim created, not Marduk. The waters of chaos were all that there was until God spoke. Then God said, "Let there be light." Was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning one day. Then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so, and God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day. God did not have to defeat a dragon and use the corpse to create the world. God spoke it. God spoke into darkness and created the light. And then God spoke, and the expanse, King James, the firmament, it referred to, it was a Hebrew word that described maybe a sheet of copper. And you could beat copper into a bowl. God spoke, and the firmament separated the waters of chaos in up and out. So you have waters below and waters above. And he called the firmament heaven. Verse 9. Then God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, a third day. Now notice the repetition of ideas. This is poetry. This is Hebrew poetry. In English, we rhyme sounds. The Hebrews rhymed ideas. And they did that often through repetition. God spoke, and plant life sprouted from the lifeless soil, growing in the light God had already created. Then on the fourth day, God created the sun, the moon, and the stars, set them in the skies. He then set the seasons in motion. On the fifth day, God spoke, and creatures sprang to life in the seas and in the skies. Now, turn to 24, verse 24. Then God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after their kind. And it was so. God made, let's emphasize that, God, Elohim, made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And Elohim saw that it was good. He has set the stage. Sun and moon, stars in the sky, plants across the face of the earth, animals in the sea, on the land, in the sky. And now it was time for Elohim to take the next step to reach the pinnacle of his creative endeavors. Verse 26. Then Elohim said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Elohim created man in his own image. In the image of Elohim, he created him, male and female, he created them. Elohim blessed them, and Elohim said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Then Elohim said, behold, I've given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. Elohim saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. We have two ancient stories that Abram would have known. And these two stories, thousands of years old, yield a worldview. You know what a worldview is? Your worldview is the way you see yourself in your world. Your worldview dictates how you look at life and the meaning of life, what has meaning. We have two different, very dramatically different stories that yield two very dramatically different worldviews. The Babylonians' worldview. The world was created for the use of the gods. And people were created to be slaves. Made from an evil God's body, the world is evil. The Bible's worldview, the worldview of that story that Abram heard around his family's kitchen table. The world is very good and was created for us to rule. People are made in God's image and are God's co-rulers of the world. That means people have intrinsic value. We are not slaves. We are kings and queens. The world was created for us to rule. 1,000 years later, King David of Israel wrote, "When I look at the night sky and see the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you set in place, what are people that you should think about them? Mere mortals that you should care for them? Yet you made them only a little lower than Elohim, and crowned them with glory and honor. You gave them charge of everything you made, putting all things under their authority, the flocks and the herds, and all the wild animals, the birds in the sky, the fish in the sea, and everything that swims in the ocean currents." The world was created for us to rule. Now you may be thinking, but Rick, these stories are thousands of years old. Don't we need something more modern? I mean, are we just supposed to trust Genesis 1 simply because it's in the Bible? What about evolution? Well, let's talk about the story of evolution. Evolution is a story written to explain how the world came to be. And I know, it's called the theory of evolution. But what is a theory? It is an explanation of observed phenomena, of reality, an explanation that has evidence to support it. So yeah, evolution is a story to explain how all this came to be. And it goes something like this. In the beginning, there was nothing. And then there was a big bang, an explosion, out of which all matter and energy came into being. Wait a minute, doesn't that sound like Genesis 1? And as matter and energy and gases flung outward from that massive explosion, the gases coalesced into balls of fire, stars, suns, lights in the darkness of creation. And those suns began to emit gravitational pull. And as molten rock came flying out from that explosion, bits and pieces of those rocks were pulled in by the gravity of the stars and began to circle around those stars. Around one of those stars, on one of those planets, as the molten rock and matter began to cool, condensation occurred. Dry land and seas appeared. This rocked on, pardon the pun, for billions of years until life appeared in the primordial sea. Now, it's interesting. Scientists don't know how that happened. They've had theories over the years to explain it, but each of those theories have been debunked by secular scientists who acknowledge doesn't fit what we know of the primordial seas. Some scientists refer to life as a cosmic accident. But evolution's story says that bits and pieces of life coalesced into single cells. And those single cells then coalesced into multi-cell life. And the multi-cell lives then expanded and evolved into invertebrate life. And the invertebrate life over billions of years then evolved into vertebrate life. And eventually, over billions and billions of years, several of those vertebrates climbed out of the primordial sea to live on dry land. And they continued to evolve through natural selection and mutation. One species then produced another species, which then produced another species, and it spread throughout the world over billions of years until finally the primate species first appeared, and it produced another primate species, which produced another, which ultimately resulted in humans. Homo sapiens. That, in a nutshell, is the story of evolution, as I understand it. Now, based on that story, there's a possible evolutionist worldview, and I have this in your notes, and I've read philosophical writers and scientists who have espoused this worldview. Reality, life, and even consciousness is an accident. A cosmic accident in defiance of the odds. People are animals with no more intrinsic value than other animals. They hold that any value you see in yourself or others is an illusion. It is not real. Now, evolution doesn't mention God. So evolutionists rule out God. They say we are accidentally born, we accidentally live, we accidentally die. And that is the end of our story. 3 stories. 3 very different worldviews. Which worldview would you choose? I want to give you 4 things to think about as you mull that question over, and I hope you will. A lot of people, was it Socrates who said the unexamined life is not worth living? A lot of people have not stopped and thought about their worldview, how they see the world, how they see themselves, how they see one another, how they see reality. They've not thought it through. I would challenge you to think it through. Don't just slip into a worldview that's handed to you on a platter. 4 things to think about while you're mulling this question. People, evolutionists, scientists, have been known to say that we who follow Jesus accept the Bible story and the Bible worldview with blind faith. I would argue that nothing could be further from the truth. There is plenty of evidence that the Bible is accurate, that the Bible is trustworthy, that our worldview makes the best sense, that God does exist. You want some scientific evidence? I point you to the Big Bang. When I was in college, the Big Bang hadn't filtered down into common academia. I'd never heard of it. We were taught that the philosophers all said the universe is eternal, has always been and always will be. And so the Bible isn't true. Well, now we know the universe had a beginning. Scientific evidence. I already shared personal evidence of the reality of God. 4 things to think about as we mull over this question. Thing 1, evolutionists rely on blind faith. 2, challenge an evolutionist's theory, and he will react like a Baptist who's told that God doesn't exist. And see, they have blind faith over several issues, and one of those issues is their theory does not explain how life began. They trust blindly that they'll figure it out one day, but it doesn't explain how life began. Thing two to think about as you mull over this question about which worldview will I adopt, there is no fossil evidence of cross-speciation. And you go, cross, what? Remember evolution? The story teaches us that one species evolved into another species, which evolved into another species. Primates, become human. Fish become lizards, which became birds. The problem with the theory is they can't find any evidence of it. In the fossil record, there is no missing link. You've heard that term? They've been searching for missing links for the various species jumps, and they can't find it. They've been searching since 1859, when Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, was published. For 163 years they've been searching, but they blindly trust that they'll find the evidence. Third thing to think about. I love this one. Evolution, as I presented the story to you, which is the typical approach to evolutionary theory, defies one of the laws of physics, one of the laws of thermodynamics, the law of entropy, which says that left to themselves, systems naturally go from high complexity to low complexity, less complexity, more complexity to less complexity, from order to disorder, from order to chaos. Evolution says exactly the opposite. That very simple life forms went from disorder to order, from simplicity to complexity. You know that doesn't work. Think about your kitchen pantry, your sock drawer, or your bedroom closet. If you don't input energy into one of those three systems, what happens? That becomes a mess, right? It goes from order to chaos, from order to disorder. But evolutionists believe that the law of thermodynamics, entropy, doesn't apply to them. Now, scientists, philosophers who espouse evolution quite often say, you can't believe evolution and believe the Bible. I have read accounts of Christians who are scientists who believe evolution, and they're very much embarrassed by their faith because they believe evolution disproves the Bible. And we may have some folks here, Christians who say, well, you can't believe the Bible and believe evolution. Our convention split over that issue and some others. I would argue both groups are wrong. Both groups are wrong. Fourth thing I want you to consider, the age-old battle of science versus religion. They've been battling for centuries, even though if you study the history of science, the Christian, Judeo-Christian worldview made it possible for people to study the world because it demythologized the world, but I digress. Here's the thing. Science and religion come into conflict when they forget their purposes. Why they were created, what they're supposed to be about. The purpose of science. Science tells us how. The purpose of religion. Religion tells us who. Science tells us how the world works. Religion tells us who works the world. Science tells us how we are. You get sick, you go to your favorite scientist, right? The doctor. And he tells you how you are. Religion tells us who we are. Who we are. Now, I would argue that the Bible cannot disprove evolution, for it was not written for that purpose. It was not written to tell us how things were created, folks. It was written to tell us who created things and what is our place in it. I would further argue, and I've made this case to students pursuing science, geology, physics, and the like, I would further argue that evolution cannot disprove the claims of the Bible, for it was not written for that purpose. It was not designed to tell us who is behind it. It was designed to tell us how it works. Now, I'm just going to be honest with you. I think evolution is a really good way to explain how things have come to be the way they are, with one caveat. Clearly, natural selection works. We're taller, stronger today than we were 500 years ago. Dogs are dramatically different than they were 500 years ago. You ought to study the evolutionary chain of horses and see how they have evolved. Natural selection, the fit survive. Mutation makes it possible for us to survive. If we do not adapt, if we do not mutate, we die off. Can anybody say dinosaurs? Okay. Evolution clearly explains how things work within species, but the theory has yet to prove that one species actually jumps into another. Evolution makes a good explanation for how things work, but it makes a terrible world view. Now, I ask you, which worldview would you choose? I prefer the story that gives life, especially my life, meaning and purpose. And the story found in Genesis 1 tells me that the world was created by God for us to rule. And next week, we're going to see another reason why the world was created. Let's pray. Father, you know one of my pet peeves is the idea that Christians just have to believe. They just have to take it in faith, whatever it might be. That Jesus lived, that Jesus died, that Jesus lived again, that God created the world, that there are still miracles today. We just have to take it in faith. Father, help us to be more intellectually honest about our faith, to think critically about our faith, to not be afraid of interfacing with those who have a different worldview, because we have thought through